Thank you for that introduction. So just to recap, my name is Justin Mayer. I'm originally from Los Angeles, but about 5 years ago, this month actually, exactly 5 years ago, that my partner and I, we found a house in the Italian Alps, and we've been spending a lot of our time there. I am building Fortressa, which is the app store for open source. This is my latest project. In my spare time, as mentioned, I maintain some open source projects like Pelican, Virtual Fish, which gives you virtual environments for fish shell, AutoPub, which is for automating package publication to PyPI, and probably too many other projects. So, quick question, how many people here develop an open source project that generates some money? Doesn't matter how much, but some. Okay, it looks like 3, okay. Now, who has an open source project that generates like an actual livable wage, like you could live off of it in a year? Wow, congratulations to both of you. That's awesome. Fantastic. It makes me really happy. We're definitely going to talk more about that. So today we're going to cover these basic points. We're going to talk about how open source affects what other people call AI. I will keep calling it so-called because I don't like that term, and we'll get into that later. How open source improves ethics in software, the exploding growth of commercial open source, which it sounds like 2 of you have already figured out how to do, how to make money with open source, which is related to that, fake open source licenses that I think one should avoid. Again, my opinion, your mileage may vary, and the rise of open source and user applications. So it was back in, how many people here have ever used the Netscape browser back in the day? All right, so there's a few of us. All right, good to know. So Mark Andreessen is the person who developed Netscape. And he, 12 years ago in 2011, wrote this article that essentially amounts to software is eating the world. And it's been repeated over and over again, and you can read it for yourself. It's a long treatise on how everything is being replaced with software. All of these legacy processes that were paper-based and more and physical-based are now being replaced with software. One of the problems with that is that most of this is proprietary. And what that means is that you have this repeated pattern in my experience, because I've been observing it for far too long, is that you see this scrappy one or a handful of people, they develop a product, it's really useful, it's either free or very inexpensive, you try it as an early adopter, you really like it, you start telling your friends start telling their friends, and you get this critical mass going. Well, at some point, someone looks at it and goes, wow, like this project, this thing we created, like it's starting to get a lot of users. Like we should figure out how we can, extract more of the value, that we are giving all of these people. And so they start doing things like raising prices, restricting the amount of features that you can use, and this, or it's then sold to another company. Say it's a company you don't really agree with, ethically, or that has policies that you don't like, and then you've already invested a lot of your life into this product. So this pattern gets repeated over and over again. In English, we say, the first hit is free, and hit refers to drugs. So a drug dealer might give you the first drug, for free, knowing that you're going to like it and you're going to come back and he's going to sell you a lot more drugs. So this is kind of how proprietary software often works. And it creates a couple of problems, or a lot of problems, but one of them is vendor lock-in. So you have all of your data in the system and then you can't get it out. So you have a data portability issue. You also have a data privacy issue. A lot of times, unless you're going to read all 89 pages of this privacy policy, you have no idea what they're going to do with your data. You have no idea. They can sell it to the highest bidder. It could be even if they are honest, and mean well, it can be breached, and now all of this data is in some treasure trove posted on some torrent site that you have no ability to remove. So there are data privacy issues as well. Going back to this first hit is free business, one of the things they will often do is per seat pricing. And what that means is each person who uses this software pays X number of dollars or euro per month. And this seems fair on the surface, right? If you're a 10-person company, you should pay less than if you have 1,000 employees. But it creates all kinds of other problems where you then have this perverse incentive to have less people at your company use this valuable tool. Well, we don't want to let that department use it because that's going to increase our cost by a lot. So we're going to just have these few people use it. And so there are other ways of monetizing, of modeling, of right-sizing your pricing to different size companies. That's a topic for another talk, but per seat pricing to me is one of the things that I don't really like about proprietary software. There are security issues. They've shown again and again that open source software has fewer bugs than proprietary software. I could go into that. I don't need to. It's a fact. You can look it up. But security is a big reason why proprietary software is less secure than open source software. With open source software, you can customize things. You can, if there's a feature you want, you can propose it. If they don't accept it, you can fork it and add the feature yourself. You have agency. You have some degree of control over the features and bug fixes. With proprietary software, this is not something that you have control over. You can complain, you can ask, but eventually it comes down to they either do what you want them to do or they don't, and you have no control over it. So software is eating the world, and we've talked about some of the problems with proprietary software. Well, another thing that we keep seeing mentioned in the news over and over again is that so-called AI is eating software. You can see these claims all over the internet, including NVIDIA. The CEO said this exact same thing as far back as 2017, so even 6 years ago. He was talking about AI eating software. So therefore, it must be true. But whether we believe this or not, let's just accept it as fact for the moment. So another thing that's happening is that open source is eating AI, and we'll get into why that is true. But let's just accept that for the moment. And if that's true, if software is eating the world, and so-called AI is eating software, and open source is eating so-called AI, then by some warped variation of the transitive property, open source is eating the world. Now, obviously, it's doing that for a bunch of reasons, and not just because of what people are calling artificial intelligence. So back to this term, briefly, an aside. The more I read about what people call AI, the less intelligent it sounds. What has been achieved in the last 6 months alone is incredible, with image generation, the large language models, and all of the GPT variants. It's really incredible. But it's not intelligence. It's not learning either. I used to think, okay, well, machine learning. This is a more accurate term. Kind of. They don't learn, not the way we do. You can't, you have a baby, it learns. It just observes its surroundings and learns. That's not what these things do. And maybe this is just Justin being pedantic, being picky about words, which I often do. But I just don't really like this term. There's a computer scientist and former member of the Italian parliament named Stefano Quintarelli, and he was way ahead of his time 3.5 years ago when he suggested that we should drop the term artificial intelligence, and we should adopt a more appropriate and scope-limited terminology for these technologies that better describe what these technologies are. He proposed systematic approaches to learning algorithms and machine inferences, a wonderful new acronym that is, of course, pronounced Salami. So this is the term that I prefer. When people talk about AI, I'm like, oh, Salami, sure. It's like you can't, Salami can't love you, right? But when you hear of AI, oh, AI could fall in love with me or seek to destroy me. Like, no, it's Salami. It can't do any of those things. It's not going to try to overthrow us. They're tools. It's like a hammer or a screwdriver. They can do many things, but it's still just a bunch of software running on a computer. It's not intelligent the way that we are, and until we come up with Asimov's positronic brain that mimics how our brains work, it's never going to be intelligent in the way that we are. So maybe that'll change someday, but until then, it's still just Salami. Pictured here in its usual data center habitat. But now that I am done nitpicking words, until recently there were two choices. You could either spend enormous sums of money on computing infrastructure to train models, or you could rely on corporate proprietary products like DALL-E, Midjourney, and other things like that. This is now being challenged by open source projects that can run on your own computers, even ones that aren't particularly powerful. In fact, these silly Salami images that I generated were on this machine using a program called Diffusion B, which is an open source project based on Stable Diffusion, which you're more than welcome to play with and check out. The generation is actually quite rapid. And the quality of the output of these tools is improving very rapidly. And the primary driver is the iterative improvement provided by people coming together and contributing to open source. And you can also brew install Diffusion B. And if for some reason you aren't using these amazing new open source tools to generate images of cyborg cats, then really, what are you doing with your life? Come on, you can spend it in better ways. This is how you should be spending your life. So large learning, whatever the LLM acronym stands for, I'm too tired to remember. But these tools are also, just like the image generation ones, are exploding every day. There's some new variation of some other tool building on top of the open source thing that someone else did the day before. You can download GPT-4all and run something that is comparable. It's probably not going to outclass the latest V4 version of ChatGPT. But you can run these things on your own machines. I've run this on this notebook. It's impressive that technology can now be run on this machine, and that's only happening because of open source. It can even run on your phone. This is another project that is being developed right now that will run on a phone. So over time, this is just going to become more and more widespread. So going back to the kind of traditional trajectory of proprietary software, it has almost always taken the form of products that are focused entirely on generating profits, and these software industry sectors usually become dominated by winner-take-all category killers from one or two companies. So you have these winner-take-all things like desktop operating systems, right? Microsoft and Apple. Mobile phone operating systems, you have Apple and Google. Accounting software and tax preparation. Well, at least in North America, you have Intuit and nobody else. Photo and video editing, Adobe, and a bunch of other very, very tiny companies that just struggle for the crumbs. So you look at that trend, and then you add the enormous cost of servers, data centers, cooling, insane amounts of storage, RAM, GPU, required to train these models. And it's natural to conclude that only the richest, most powerful companies will control this new class of software. But we're already seeing from all of those open source projects that I just linked to that that's not proving to be the case. That expectation is not panning out. Even Google, one of their researchers published an internal memo that got leaked that basically says, we, Google, have no moat. And a moat is the body of water around a castle that prevents people from attacking it. And the contention is, we, Google, have no way of preventing other companies, other open source tools, to compete with us, mainly because of open source. That's the entire purpose of this article. And the claim is that open source, Salami will outcompete Google and OpenAI. One of the really money quotes in this leaked memo was, open source models are faster, more customizable, more private, and pound for pound more capable. They are doing things with $100 and 13 billion parameters that we, Google, struggle with at $10 million and 540 billion parameters, which is a really interesting way of looking at this seismic shift. Quick aside about OpenAI, anytime you hear someone name their product open something, just think closed something, because that's usually what ends up happening in the end either way. OpenAI is not open source, not fully anyway, not anymore. It used to be a nonprofit, and now it's definitely for profit. So just keep that in mind when you think about OpenAI. And spoiler alert, OpenAI gets a lot of headlines today, but it is almost an inevitability that nearly all of this salami will become commodity open source inputs that power the entire world. Today, your smart light bulbs, whether you realize this or not, actually runs an embedded Linux operating system on your light bulb. In the future, your light bulbs will become these seemingly self-aware sentient beings powered by open source salami models. Won't that be fun? I look forward to these sentient light bulbs. So the ethics of proprietary software also are problematic. You have this topic that's been raised many times in Python conferences. As developers, if we are asked to add a feature that doesn't align with our ethics and our core values, we shouldn't look the other way and just justify it with, I was just doing my job. But what are our options, right? If expressing the concerns doesn't have any effect, traditionally the only choice is to quit and find another job. But open source changes that game. Now if someone adds an ethically problematic feature to an open source project and refuses to remove it, despite public outcry, the community will simply fork the project and remove the morally repugnant code. It's another big problem easily solved with open source. So how do you make money in open source if anyone can use it for free? People will just assume that this isn't really something that's feasible because it's free. Anyone can download it. But companies like Red Hat and GitLab have kind of led the way and proven that not only is it possible, but can also be highly profitable. And that was just the beginning of a flood of companies that are making money via open source. There's something called the COS index, or commercial open source index. And over the last 5 years alone, they've tracked all of this data, and they have found that there's more than 40 open source companies earning greater than $100 million in annual revenue, yielding more than $100 billion in realized outcomes in terms of either acquisitions or IPOs. So this comes from people who are venture capitalists that are specializing in this field. This is the data they collected. So this is a lot of money generated by a product that ostensibly is free. And believe it or not, this is something that you can do as well. This is within your reach. And if you take nothing else from this talk, I really want you to internalize that you can, it doesn't matter whether it's millions of dollars, but you can make money doing open source. And there are several different ways that you can do it. Probably the most common these days is some version of hosted software as a service. So you have say a web application, and you publish it on GitHub, but you also provide a hosted version, because guess what? Figuring out how to host some random web application you found on GitHub, it's not easy, and it requires work. Yes, okay, there's a Docker file and a Docker Compose. It's still work. You still are becoming a sysadmin, whether you want to or not. So you can have a hosted version, and people will gladly pay for that privilege to not have to become a sysadmin and deploy it themselves. And if they do something that doesn't align with your values, if they go belly up, if they sell off to some other company, you have recourse. You can fork it. Someone else will fork it. It's not the end of the road for you. Another one is dual license, and this is where it is free and open source, for the people that are willing to use it within the confines of what it offers. So you can make it, say, GPL. And if you're like, well, if we make changes to the code, we don't want to share the changes that we made, which is required under the GPL. Okay, that's fine. You can get a commercial license, and we'll work out, a price, and then you can pay that price, and then you don't have to share. And everyone wins. The company wins. The open source community wins. The maintainer who's, putting time into it wins. There's open core, where part of the software is free and open source under some type of OSI license, and the other part of it, sometimes it'll say, everything outside of the EE directory in the project root is licensed under the MIT or Apache or a BSD, but everything in the EE directory is essentially proprietary license. And that's another way that you can kind of split this divide and make money from more advanced features that typically only enterprise customers need. You can also offer some kind of support subscription where you can install it yourself, you can use it yourself, but if you're like, I need help, generally, you don't really have options. Well, you can give them options and say, sure, here's some support contracts, which can help you earn money from the thing that you're working on. I want to briefly talk about what is open source, because there's more and more money piles into open source from venture capital. There's more and more people who want to benefit from the free marketing that you get when you say, oh, I have this new open source thing, but they don't want to actually be open source. They don't want the obligations that come with it. So this is what I call fake open source. And so, they will often say they're open source, but if you really look at it, they're not using OSI-approved licenses like MIT, GPL, Apache, BSD. They create new licenses with bland names like business source license or server-side public license, and then you read them and you're like, well, wait a minute, this doesn't sound like open source. I can use it for my personal use, but if I host it for someone else, that's not allowed. It doesn't sound like open source anymore. Another one is called a Ventral open source, and this is something that Sentry uses, where they call it open source, but it's only open source after a certain period of time. And so all right, well, what if a bug gets fixed? You have to wait for a year or more to get that bug fixed because it's technically not open source yet? I don't know. I understand why. I know what they're trying to do. I get it. It makes perfect sense from a business perspective. I have a bit of a problem with it. It's fine. Just don't call it open source. Call it something else. And so that's why the open source initiative exists, because they decide this is what open source means. We have this definition. If you want to do something else, do something else. Don't use the term open source. And one of the other things that's really exciting about all this open source explosion is open source applications for end users. In the past, you had things like operating systems like BSD and Linux. You had libraries like OpenSSL, libjpeg, curl. And then you have server infrastructure like Apache or Postfix. But the last few years in particular has seen this explosion of open source web and mobile applications that are designed to be used by a wide range of end users, not just like a little widget or something you plug into something else. And so we've seen things like social networks where, whereas some of us used Twitter in the past, you can now use Mastodon. That's an open source web application. Instead of using 1Password, there's an open source combination of Bitwarden on the client side and Vaultwarden on the server side. You can use SyncThing instead of Dropbox. You can use cal.com instead of Calendly. Shynet, which is a random obscure Django application, you can use instead of Google Analytics. So open source is now fully center stage. We are sitting in the front row of this explosion. And so now is the time to be part of this incredibly exciting paradigm shift. And I'm here to ask you, what are you waiting for? I'll just quickly add that you can find me, that's my personal site at justinmayer.com. There's Fortressa, which is my project I'm working on. This is Mastodon. If you must use the dead bird site, then that's me over there, but use Mastodon for all the aforementioned reasons.
Okay. Thank you. Perfect time. And we have one question. No question. What do you think? What do you think about the issue of privacy and the consenting of regarding the data set of Salami are trained on, for example, images by artists that didn't consent it?
That's an excellent question. So whether it's a large language model that has just sucked in all of the text in the world, or whether it's image generation that's doing the same thing for images, it's regurgitating our data, the data that you've posted on the internet somewhere. And it does raise really interesting questions as to how appropriate is it for data that you did not intend to be used in that purpose to be used this way. Some people might argue, well, you put something out in the public, you didn't have any expectation that it would be private, that's why you put it up on the internet for the whole world to see. You obviously didn't expect it to be private, but you also didn't expect someone else to suck it all up, mix it around a lot, spit out some stuff, and then charge money for it either. So it's a thorny problem, and I don't know how we're going to work it out. This is why you have this, in Hollywood, you have a writer's strike right now that's going on. And one of their biggest problems is they want a moratorium of 3 years on this question of using large language models on their work, because they don't want to be just automated out of a job. And there's a lot of real concern there. So I don't know what the answer is, but I think there needs to be some framework where the people whose data is being used are you obviously can't ask for everyone's permission for 8 billion people, but we could figure out ways of monetizing and figuring out some kind of royalty system. It's a big problem. I don't know how you fix it, but hopefully we'll find a way.
Okay, we have another question. So 2 questions, but very similar. So is Sentry eventual open source? And what do you think about their licensing as a defense strategy against abuse?
So the question is,
Sentry.
right, so Sentry is
Open source or not?
Yeah, so my argument is they, and I know David Kramer, he's a great guy, the founder and CEO of Sentry. He looks at it as eventual open source. That's the term he uses. And, it's true. It's true. It eventually becomes open source. And like I said before, I respect that that's what they're trying to prevent people from, taking their project, forking it, giving it a new name, and charging money for it. I get it. It doesn't seem fair. It doesn't seem fair to me. It doesn't seem fair to them. So I think it's really more just a question of being somewhat careful with the terminology. I think if they want to call it source available, that then eventually becomes fully open source. And again, this is just nitpicking. This is me just nitpicking words. It's really not even fair to them. But I think it's important that people understand when something is fully open source and when it's not. That's all.
Okay, we have another question.
Yeah.
What is Fortressa? And does it help with the problem you raised?
So thank you. That's very kind of someone to ask that question. Fortressa is an answer to a problem that I had. And the dilemma is, okay, great. There's all of these open source web applications that I just described, but installing them is really hard. And I'm not going to spend a Sunday figuring out someone's TypeScript stack that I don't know how to use. But I'm willing to do that if it means that I can automate the process and then other people can benefit from the work that I've done. So that was the idea. I wanted to take all of these SaaS tools that some of which I don't want to use for the reasons I mentioned, and use these open source equivalents, these substitutes, but the maintenance burden of them is not, it's not worth it for me to do just for myself. But if I do it and then share that as like an app store for open source, where you can just say, okay, I want this Vault Warden, I want this for scheduling, then you just get those applications, and you don't have to be a sysadmin, you don't have to do those things. So that's why I built Fortressa.
Okay, we have time just for last question.
Sure.
For a very quick answer. If you don't like Perseats or reduced feature, how do you bucket different pricing levels?
Okay, I'm sorry. Say it one more time. I didn't quite get that.
Okay. If you prefer to
Yeah.
If you don't like
Okay, if you don't like per seat or reduced features, how do you bucket different pricing levels?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. The thing that I punted on, sure. Okay, so one of the ones that I prefer is usage-based pricing. This doesn't work for every kind of software, but it works great for some of them. So let's say that you are monitoring cron jobs. Okay, you have a tool, a SaaS product that monitors cron jobs and tells you when they don't run. You know, they fail for some reason. Well, most of the time, you probably don't know when they fail, right? It's supposed to generate an email, you know, but like your email server gets blocked or it gets caught in spam. You don't know that your cron jobs aren't running. So these tools exist. And one thing you can do is base the pricing not per user, but per cron job that you're monitoring, or have tiers for the number of notifications that you're sending. So usage-based pricing is a great way of allowing your whole company to use this thing. You're not going to say, oh, we're just going to let these 5 people use it. So that gets around that problem very neatly, and a team of 10 is going to have less usage than a team of 10,000. So that's an example of a great way to do it. There are others, but it's probably not in scope for, for right now.
Okay, so we have a question, but the time is running out. So thanks to Justin.